Paul McCartney stopped walking so suddenly that the woman behind him nearly walked into his shoulder. His eyes locked on a homeless veteran sitting alone beside the curb, cradling a battered acoustic guitar whose body had been split and repaired more times than anyone could count. The old man wasn't singing, he wasn't asking for money, he wasn't even looking up. He simply pressed one trembling finger onto a string, row, and played a single note. Paul's hand flew to his mouth. His breathing caught. For a long second, the entire street seemed to disappear. The buses, the traffic, the conversations, even the cold November wind faded into a distant blur. People slowed as they noticed the expression on his face. A young couple stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. A taxi driver leaned out of his window. No one understood why one quiet guitar note had left one of the world's most celebrated musicians looking as though he'd just seen a ghost. Without surprise, without confusion, almost as though he had been expecting this moment for years, he looked directly at Paul and whispered, "I never thought you'd hear it." For a moment, no one moved. Paul couldn't answer. His lips parted, but no words came. He stared at the broken guitar, as if it carried a memory he had spent half a lifetime trying to bury. How could a stranger, a homeless veteran on an ordinary American street, know a note that only a handful of people had ever played that way? But that moment didn't start there. It had begun decades earlier, long before the cracked guitar, long before the cardboard sign asking for help, and long before grief quietly connected two men who had never met. On a cold autumn afternoon, beneath gray skies and the endless rhythm of a busy American city, a forgotten veteran sat on the same stretch of sidewalk he had chosen every day for nearly 12 years. Thousands of people walked past him without slowing down. They saw the worn military jacket, the weathered beard, the broken guitar, and the small cardboard sign resting beside an old canvas backpack. Almost nobody noticed the music. Paul McCartney was about to become the first person who truly did. The veteran's name was Daniel Harper, and although thousands of people passed him every week, almost none of them knew it. To the morning commuters, he was simply another homeless man sitting on the corner with an old guitar. Office workers hurried by with steaming coffee cups in their hands. Tourists paused only long enough to toss a few coins into his open guitar case before disappearing into the endless flow of the city. Delivery drivers nodded politely. Shop owners recognized his face, but rarely his voice. He never shouted for attention. He never begged. He never chased anyone down the sidewalk. Every afternoon, just after 1 o'clock, Daniel quietly unpacked the same faded military backpack, unfolded the same worn blanket onto the concrete, and lifted the same cracked acoustic guitar into his hands. The guitar had survived rainstorms, freezing winters, and years of neglect. Deep scratches covered its wooden body. The finish had long since disappeared, and a thin fracture stretched from the bridge toward the sound hole, carefully held together by old repairs that looked almost as tired as the man who played it. The cardboard sign beside him never changed. U.S. Navy veteran. Anything helps. God bless. Yet people rarely looked beyond those words. What they never realized was that Daniel wasn't sitting there because that corner earned the most money. He had turned down better locations countless times. There was another reason. Every single afternoon, at precisely the same hour, he faced west toward the busy intersection and played exactly one song. Hey Jude, always the same melody, always beginning with the same unusual opening note, always ending before the final chorus. Never once did he perform another Beatles song. The nearby flower vendor had watched him for almost 9 years. One rainy afternoon, she finally asked, "Why only that one?" Daniel smiled without looking up from the strings. "Because I'm still waiting." "For who?" He gently adjusted one of the worn tuning pegs before answering. "I honestly don't know anymore." She thought he was talking about family, perhaps an old friend, maybe someone who had promised to return. But Daniel never explained further. Unknown to everyone who walked past that corner each day, he wasn't waiting for money. He wasn't waiting for sympathy. He wasn't even waiting for another chance at life. For nearly half a century, he had been waiting to fulfill a promise he had made to someone whose name he had never forgotten. And on this ordinary autumn afternoon, without either of them planning it, the one man who could finally understand that promise had just stopped walking. Paul remained exactly where he was. The sounds of the city slowly returned around him, the distant rumble of buses, footsteps against the pavement, conversations drifting through the afternoon air. But they felt strangely disconnected, as though they belonged to another world entirely. Daniel rested the guitar across his knees and studied Paul's face with quiet curiosity. "You recognized it," he said softly. Paul finally lowered his hand from his mouth. "I did." Daniel gave a faint smile. "I was beginning to think nobody ever would." Paul took one cautious step closer before kneeling beside the old veteran, ignoring the curious stares gathering around them. People had started slowing down, sensing something unusual without understanding what it was. A teenager quietly lifted his phone, while an elderly woman stopped carrying her shopping bags and simply watched. Paul's eyes never left the guitar. "That first note," he whispered. "Where did you learn to play it like that?" Daniel looked down at the weathered instrument. His fingers gently brushed the cracked wood with the care of someone touching an old friend. "I didn't learn it." He paused. "I was taught." Paul's heartbeat quickened. "By who?" Instead of answering, Daniel slowly turned the guitar over. Its back was scarred with decades of scratches, dents, and careful repairs. Near the neck, barely visible beneath layers of faded varnish, was a small brass screw that looked newer than everything surrounding it. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and removed a tiny pocket knife. With practiced hands, he loosened the screw. Paul frowned. "What are you doing?" Daniel didn't answer. A thin wooden panel lifted away from the back of the guitar, revealing a narrow hidden compartment built inside the instrument itself. Paul stared in disbelief. Carefully, almost reverently, Daniel reached inside and removed a small cloth bundle wrapped in faded navy blue fabric. The cloth itself looked older than the guitar. Its edges were worn smooth from years of careful handling. Daniel unfolded it slowly. Inside rested 3 objects: a tarnished military dog tag, a black and white photograph with its corners folded from age, and an old handwritten envelope whose paper had turned yellow with time. Paul felt his chest tighten. Daniel picked up the photograph first. It showed 4 young Navy servicemen standing shoulder to shoulder outside a military recreation hall sometime in the late 1960s. All 4 were smiling. One of them held this very guitar, though it looked almost new then. Daniel handed the picture to Paul. When Paul turned it over, his breathing stopped. Written across the back in faded blue ink were 7 simple words. "If you ever meet Paul, give him this." Paul looked up, his eyes searching Daniel's face. "You've carried this all these years?" Daniel nodded. "For 48 years. Paul swallowed hard. "But who wrote it?" Daniel carefully lifted the old envelope from the cloth bundle. His hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of a memory he had protected for nearly half a century. Then he looked directly into Paul's eyes. "The answer," he said quietly, "is the reason I've been sitting on this sidewalk every single afternoon." And for the first time since hearing that impossible note, Paul realized this meeting had never been an accident. Someone had been trying to bring them together for almost 50 years. Daniel held the weathered envelope between both hands for several long seconds before speaking again. "There was a young sailor named Michael Brennan," he said quietly. "We enlisted together in 1968. We were barely old enough to shave, convinced we were invincible, and absolutely certain the world would still be waiting for us when we came home. His eyes drifted somewhere beyond the crowded street. He carried this guitar everywhere. Every chance we had, he'd sit outside the barracks playing Beatles songs. Didn't matter if we were exhausted or scared. The moment he started playing, everything felt normal again. Paul listened without interrupting. Michael admired you more than anyone I've ever known. Not because you were famous, but because he believed your songs reminded people that kindness wasn't weakness. He used to say music could reach places that words never could. A faint smile crossed Daniel's face before disappearing just as quickly. He especially loved one song. Paul already knew the answer. Hey Jude. Daniel nodded, but he never played the opening like everyone else. He gently tapped the strings of the old guitar. He always paused just for a heartbeat before the first note. He'd say the silence mattered as much as the music. People only appreciate hope, he'd tell me, after they've heard silence. Paul slowly closed his eyes. That tiny pause, that impossible hesitation before the melody. It wasn't written anywhere. It wasn't taught in music books. It had simply become part of the way Michael played the song. Daniel had carried that tiny musical fingerprint across nearly 5 decades. Where did Michael get the guitar? Paul asked softly. Daniel smiled. He said he bought it with almost every dollar he'd saved before joining the Navy. Called it the best decision he'd ever made. His expression darkened. Until Vietnam. The traffic around them seemed to fade again. Daniel looked down at the photograph resting in Paul's hands. War changes time, he said. Days become months. Months become memories. You stop counting birthdays. You stop talking about tomorrow because tomorrow becomes a luxury. He took a slow breath. There were nights when we'd sit beneath broken buildings after everything finally went quiet. Michael would take out this guitar, even with missing strings, and somehow he'd still make music. The rest of us weren't listening because he was a great musician. Daniel's voice lowered. We were listening because for 3 or 4 minutes, we could pretend we were home. Paul felt his throat tighten. Daniel reached into the cloth bundle once more and unfolded a small, faded notebook page. The last time I ever saw him, he whispered, he handed me this guitar. His fingers trembled. He smiled and said, if anything happens, promise me you'll keep playing Hey Jude exactly the way I play it. Don't change a single note. Daniel looked directly into Paul's eyes. I laughed. I told him he was talking nonsense. I told him we'd both be back in America before Christmas. His voice cracked for the first time. We never made it to Christmas. Silence settled between them. The people gathered nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Even the city itself seemed quieter. Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. Just before they evacuated me, I found this envelope tucked inside the guitar. He carefully placed it into Paul's hands. I've never opened it. Paul stared at him in disbelief. You've carried a letter addressed to me for almost 50 years. And you never once read it? Daniel slowly shook his head. It wasn't mine. Then his eyes filled with tears. I made a promise to my best friend. And after losing everything else in my life, I refused to lose that too. Paul looked down at the unopened envelope resting in his hands. The paper had yellowed with age. The edges were brittle. The seal remained perfectly intact. Whatever waited inside had been silent for nearly half a century. And for the first time since this impossible meeting began, Paul realized that the next few moments might change not only Daniel's life, but his own forever. Paul held the unopened envelope with extraordinary care, as though even the slightest pressure might erase the voice that had been trapped inside it for nearly half a century. His fingers rested against the faded seal. For several seconds, he couldn't bring himself to break it. Daniel quietly watched him. I've wondered what it says almost every day, he admitted. But a promise is a promise. Paul slowly nodded. And you've kept yours. Carefully, he slipped one finger beneath the brittle flap. The old adhesive gave way with a soft crackle. The paper inside unfolded with the fragile sound of history waking up. Paul began reading silently. At first, nothing changed. Then his breathing slowed. His shoulders stiffened. Halfway down the page, he stopped, his eyes filled with tears. He lowered the letter before he could finish. Daniel immediately looked worried. "What is it?" Paul couldn't answer. He simply closed his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice had almost disappeared. "He never wanted anything from me." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Paul looked back at the letter. "Not an autograph, not money, not fame. He only wanted me to know something." Paul swallowed hard before reading the final lines aloud. "Dear Paul, if this guitar ever finds its way to you, don't remember me as a soldier. Remember me as someone who believed your music kept frightened young men alive on nights when hope was the only thing we had left. Tell people that songs matter, because sometimes a melody reaches a place no medicine ever can. If I don't make it home, keep writing for the people who think they've already been forgotten." The street fell completely silent. No passing conversation, no traffic, no footsteps, only the quiet trembling in Paul's voice. He lowered the letter and covered his eyes with one hand. For years, millions of people had seen Paul McCartney smiling on stages across the world. Very few had ever seen him unable to speak. Daniel stared at him, overwhelmed. "I never knew," he whispered. "I thought maybe it was something personal." Paul looked at the veteran through tear-filled eyes. "It is personal." He folded the letter with immense care before placing it back into the envelope. Then, without saying another word, he stepped forward and wrapped both arms around Daniel. The old veteran froze. For a brief moment, he didn't know how to respond. Then he slowly returned the embrace, not as a homeless man being comforted by a celebrity, but as one friend completing a promise for another. Around them, several strangers quietly wiped away tears. An elderly woman removed her glasses. The flower vendor lowered her head. Even the teenager who had been recording the encounter slowly put his phone away. Some moments deserved witnesses, not spectators. Paul gently stepped back, keeping one hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I can't give Michael another tomorrow," he said softly, "but I can make sure the promise he trusted you with doesn't end on this sidewalk." Then Paul reached into his coat pocket, took out his phone, and made a call that would quietly change Daniel Harper's life before the sun set that very evening. Paul never called a reporter. He never contacted a television station. He never told anyone to bring cameras. Before sunset, Daniel was quietly checked into a small hotel just a few blocks away. The receptionist welcomed him with the same respect she would have shown any other guest. No questions, no judgment, just a room, a warm meal, and a bed that Daniel admitted he hadn't slept in for longer than he could remember. The next morning, Paul returned carrying two things. The first was a professionally restored guitar case. The second was a folder. Inside it were documents Paul had spent the entire evening arranging. Medical care through a veterans support organization, temporary housing, counseling for years of untreated trauma, and something Daniel never expected to see again. A job. Not charity, not a favor. A local youth music academy had agreed to bring him in as a guitar instructor for children just beginning their musical journey. Paul smiled as Daniel stared silently at the paperwork. "You spent decades keeping someone else's music alive," he said. "Now it's time to help someone discover their own." Daniel's eyes filled again. "I don't know how to repay you." Paul gently shook his head. "You already have." He looked toward the old envelope, resting safely inside its protective folder. "You carried Michael's final words across 50 years without breaking your promise. Paul paused before adding quietly, "Very few people are that faithful." Over the following weeks, Daniel slowly disappeared from the street corner, where so many people had once walked past without noticing him. But Paul wasn't finished. There was one final promise hidden inside Michael's letter. Near the bottom, written in smaller handwriting, almost overlooked by time, was one last request. If Daniel ever makes it home, tell him not to spend the rest of his life looking backward. Paul folded the letter carefully. Then he looked at Daniel with a gentle smile. "I think," he said, "it's finally time we helped you go home." Daniel had no idea that the next phone call would reunite him with the family he believed he had lost forever. 8 months later, the corner where Daniel Harper had spent nearly 12 years quietly disappeared back into the rhythm of the city. People still hurried past. Traffic still filled the intersection, but the old blanket, the cardboard sign, and the broken guitar were gone. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, Daniel now unlocked the doors of a small community music center where a dozen children waited eagerly with second-hand guitars resting across their laps. Some came from military families. Others came from homes where life had already taught them more hardship than childhood should ever allow. Daniel always began every lesson the same way. He closed his eyes, paused for a single heartbeat, then played the first note of Hey Jude. One afternoon, a little boy raised his hand. "Mr. Harper, why do you always wait before the first note?" Daniel smiled, because now he finally knew the answer himself. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "hope begins in the silence before the music." A few weeks later, Paul received a handwritten letter. It wasn't from a record company or a journalist. It was from Daniel. Inside was one simple sentence: "Michael's promise finally made it home." Paul quietly folded the letter and placed it inside the same piano where he had written countless songs throughout his life. Some melodies become worldwide hits. Some become memories. But every once in a lifetime, a single song becomes something far greater. It becomes a promise carried through war, grief, and 50 years of silence, until two strangers finally meet at exactly the right moment. And perhaps that's the greatest power music has ever possessed. Not to make us famous, but to remind us that no faithful act of love is ever truly forgotten.